As we know, Sukkot is quickly approaching, so we'll discuss some Inyani Sukkah. So we know there are many mitzvahs on the Yontiv of Sukkot, one being sitting in the Sukkah, as well as there is a mitzvah of Daled Minim, the four species, commonly known as lulav and estrog in North America. But in Israel they call it the mitzvah of the Daled Minim, which is technically the correct way, but everyone knows what we're talking about. It's the four species. So we have the lulav and the estrog, because lulav is the tallest and estrog is the most expensive. In fact, in many places what they do is to basically just buying the estrog. In other words, the other three minim, the aravos and the hadassim, and the lulav is the same. You get the same exact, meaning quality-wise. There's nothing special about the lulav and aravos and hadassim. It's how much the estrog is that determines the set usually. So we have this mitzvah of the four species, which we begin in a couple of days. So what bracha do we make on the mitzvah of Daled Minim, on the mitzvah of lulav and estrog, the four species? That's a separate discussion in the Gemara in terms of whether that's what we view it as one mitzvah, four separate mitzvahs. But we assume, well, halacha, you need all four. That if you only have three out of the four, you're not getting the mitzvah. But that's a discussion, different opinions, within the Gemara about halacha l'maisa. We have to have all four species. So what bracha do we make on shaking of the Daled Minim, on shaking of the lulav? Correct. So Jeff says we make the bracha on the tilat lulav. Should it be something else at first glance? Obviously, in second glance, it shouldn't be, because that's what we're making. But is that the bracha one would, based on the principles of brachas, is that the bracha we should have made? So to understand that, we have to go back a little bit and give you a little introduction to Hilchas Brachas. Because the Gemara in Psachim in Dav Zayin Amud Beis 7 and 7b, and the Rambam in Hilchas Brachas on Perek Yud Aleph, chapter 11, he gives us, we're not going to do all of them today, but he gives us a couple of principles in terms of on the bracha. In fact, specifically, if you use al or la, should I say lito lulav or al natilas? What's the difference between the two? And not this lulav, I'll just use that one because that's what we're doing. But in terms of the general rule, he's talking about, like we had this coming off Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, that's where we had a major dispute between the Rambam and Rabbeinu Tam on what was the text, what was the nusach habracha of the bracha on shofar. Is it lishmoa kol shofar or al tekiyas shofar? So Rabbeinu Tam says it's al tekiyas, and the Rambam writes it was lishmoa. The way we passed, like the Rambam, we made a lot with the la. So that was two. There was a double machlokes Rabbeinu Tam and the Rambam. In one versus the prefix la al, and the Rabbeinu Tam used the word tekiyah shofar, and the Rambam used lishmo, and that's because that's the fundamental machlokes in terms of what is the nature of the mitzvah of shofar. Is the main part the tekiyah, or is the main part the shmiyah? So that would explain the whether you make tekiyah or shmoah. But in terms of al or la, what's this machlokas Rabbeinu Tam and the Rambam, whether you put a lamed prefix or an al? So that the Gemara and the Rambam puts it all together. He says there are three basic rules in terms of when we make la versus al. So the first one is when you make a bracha over lasiyason, when you make a bracha before you do it, there are two options. You can make a bracha before you do the mitzvah, after you do the mitzvah, in the middle. And the general rule is we try to make a bracha before we do the mitzvah, with different exceptions to the rule. Like perhaps the classic exception is a convert, is a ger, that the Gemara says the convert doesn't make the bracha until after they come out of the mikvah. But that's for very obvious reasons, because efshar, it's impossible the other way, because the person's not Jewish before. In fact, which is a separate discussion in mikvah in general, when not even so much a convert, but let's say someone goes into the mikvah, the Tue May, they're spiritually defiled, so they go into the mikvah. At what point do they become pure? Is it when they're actually in the water, or they actually, not until they come out of the water, is when they actually the purification. So that is not a discussion by a ger until he comes out of the mikvah, or she comes out of the mikvah, she's not Jewish. So therefore, hence the exception. Other exceptions...
And when you're toveling, and you're in the same mikvah, but you do it the other way around. You say the bracha before you start your dipping.
Right, so, but even though the reason, right, assuming in tefillas ger, why do we tovel, why do we immerse utensils? The halacha is nothing to do with kasherus, with kosher. If you have non-kosher utensil, you have to kasher it through the means of fire, water, depending the way kibolo kach polto, the way it came in is the way it has to go out. Tfilas kelim is something else. You buy a 100% clean, unused, new vessel. You buy it from a non-Jew, so you have to bring it to the mikvah. So, and one of the reasons they explain it is because it's similar to a ger, that this like a non-Jew has to go through a conversion process to become a Jew, so to speak, your utensil has to go through that. Right, so based on that, Jeff is pointing out that tefillas kelim is different, right? But we'll come back to that one also. But let's say Shabbos, lighting candles. So obviously you have to light the candles before Shabbos. So most women accept Shabbos when they light the candles, when they make the bracha. Hence, the minig is you have to light, you light the candles. So again, those are exceptions to the rule, and we could probably sit down and list a number of exceptions, but the rule is, first you make the bracha, and then you do the mitzvah. So it's called overlas yason. So the Rambam writes, rule number one, if you're doing the bracha first, it's law. If you're doing the bracha after the mitzvah, it's al. That's one principle. The second principle the Rambam writes is, are you doing a mitzvah which is a chiyah, which is mandatory, or are you doing something which is optional? In other words, there's three different categories of mitzvahs we'll call. It's what they call a mitzvah chiyuv. It's a mandatory mitzvah like we're going to do shortly. Put on tefillin. We have an obligation every morning to put on tefillin. Matzah on Pesach. Lulav on Sukkot. They're mitzvahs that we don't have a choice. I mean, obviously we do have a choice, but if we don't do it, we are mevatel mitzvahs aseh. We nullify a positive commandment. That's one type of mitzvah. Then there's a second type, let's say tzitzis, which we'll call a conditional mitzvah. If you're wearing a four-cornered garment, then you're obligated to put tzitzis on. But strictly speaking, if you're not wearing a four-cornered garment, there is no mitzvah of tzitzis. But everyone agrees if you're wearing a four-cornered garment, you have to put tzitzis on that. Everyone agrees you get a biblical mitzvah of tzitzis. And there's a third category, which is one that now we don't even so tzitzis, everyone recommends you should do it. Technically you could find ways to circumvent it, but everyone agrees you should be putting on a four-cornered garment and putting tzitzis on. There's a third category of, we're not even recommending to do this. But if the situation happens, it's more like these are the directions how you have to take care of it, i.e. the mitzvah of get, of divorce. It's not like, okay, I only fulfilled 612 mitzvahs, let me divorce my wife now and get my... That's not even encouraged, it's not even a good thing. Well, it depends on your marriage, because the Gemara talks about getting a get in two different ways. On one hand, the Gemara says, Mizbeach morid demos, that the Mizbeach, which is a sign of love, that cries, anytime there's a divorce, two couples divorce, so implying that divorce is a bad thing. On the other hand, the Gemara calls getting a divorce shalom bayis, peace of household. And obviously it depends on if it's a relationship that could be worked out. You live in this disposable age, you're not willing to work on it, and you have kids, then obviously it's a terrible thing. But a certain abusive marriage, and maybe you shouldn't have been married in the first place. Obviously, we believe in the concept of get, and therefore you start over. In fact, there's a famous, there's a joke that they always say over that this person went to Beis Din. He wanted to get a divorce from his wife, so they go to Beis Din, they go to the court of law, and he goes over the whole process, and he gives the get. And then about 2 minutes after the process, he says, "You know what? I want to marry. Now I want to marry her again." So the guy with the Beis Din said, "What do you mean? You just got a get?" "Yeah, for a second wife, she's okay." But the point being is that sometimes get is appropriate. Sometimes in most cases, see, we go from different stages. From probably 20, 30 years ago, there might have been some that wouldn't happen, and today there are probably many that you could probably work out their own. But that's a separate discussion. But that's the mitzvah of get is that's something that we say you have to do. In fact, it's better you don't even have to come to it. But if you're going to get a divorce, you have to go through this procedure to do it. Yeah, Ryan.
I don't know if it's connected, but moving a dead body out of a house on Shabbos, is that similar to having covered for Shabbos? And the mitzvah is, you're not supposed to move a dead body out of the house, right?
Right. So it's a separate principle of how of it's called the malacha she'eina tzricha l'gufa. In other words, because to violate the biblical definition of carrying, it has to be done the way it was done, similar to the way it was done in the temple. So let's say most people carry somewhere. My coffee's in place A. It's in Tim Hortons, and I want it here. So it's a purpose to. But in the case of getting a dead body out of your house, you don't care where the dead body goes. Obviously, ultimately you want to bury, but you're not doing the burial on Shabbos. The point being is, you don't want it smelling up your house. So therefore, that would be considered a malacha she'eina tzricha l'gufa, and therefore, but that's it's a separate topic.
Not connected to the
right. So therefore, so that's what the Rambam writes. If you're doing a mitzvah that you have to do, a mitzvah chiyuvis, then we use the prefix of law before. But if we're doing a mitzvah harishus, the Rambam's example is shchita, slaughtering an animal. The Rambam says there's no obligation to slaughter an animal. If a person wants to eat meat, this is the procedure you have to do. If you don't want to eat meat, saving separate times of Yontif or other times. But in general, one does not have an obligation to eat meat, so therefore you don't have to do shchita. But if you're going to do so we make the bracha al hashchita because it's not something mandatory. In fact, I was in a cab the other day. Going from Sholem Village to McMaster, I was taking one of the residents on a visit, visiting her son, and I actually had both ways had a Muslim cab driver, one with his Pakistan. So somehow, we were talking, I told him it was the rabbi here, so we were talking about many similarities between Judaism and Islam, and that's the one we were talking about the meat that I told him. I always tell him I have a friend of mine who runs Chalal Me, but then so I was telling him, he was telling me, he meaning my friend, not the taxi driver, was telling me the difference, because as I know Muslims, if they can't find kosher meat, they'll eat. If they can't find halal meat, they'll eat kosher. But I was telling him it's not true the other way. He said yes, because the Quran, came afterwards. There was no meaning. It was implying that if Judaism came after, we would also accept halal meat. I said that's not exactly true, but we went into other things. But I said one of the differences is also that we make one bracha for the whole day. Like the shoki he has all the money, he's going to slaughter over each bracha. He doesn't make over each cow. He doesn't make a new bracha. But the Muslims, they make a bracha, blessing each time. In fact, he was asking me about what bracha we make. I think he just says you just have to say in the name of God, but not in English. But he was telling me. We had many interesting conversations back and forth. But either way, so shchita, even though we make a bracha, it's only a bracha on an optional mitzvah. Hence the text al. And the third category the Rambam gives us is if you're doing a mitzvah for yourself, so then it's law. But if you're doing the mitzvah for yourself and others, and you're doing a mitzvah, you have others in mind, etc., so then the bracha is al.
that would be just on a non-optional mitzvah.
Right, that's right. That'd be on a man. So for instance, getting back to I'll give you the example by Rosh Hashanah, by Shofar. We said there was a double dispute between Rabbeinu Tam and the Rambam. The Rambam holds the mitzvah's hearing, so he says la. He says l'shmoa, and Rabbeinu Tam says the mitzvah's blowing. He says al tekiyas. So I understand tekiya versus shmiya, but why is the Rambam forced to make why if you hold the mitzvah is l'shmoa, the mitzvah is hearing, you use the prefix la? Why can it be al shmiyas? And why can't Rabbeinu Tam be litkoa? In other words, why are they, based on these three principles I just gave, well, you only need one of them, but based on the three principles I just gave, why does the Rambam have to say la in his prefix, and why does Rabbeinu Tam have to use al? So it's consistent with their view, because according to the Rambam, the mitzvah is hearing. So who's doing the mitzvah? Everyone's hearing themselves. So if you're doing the mitzvah yourself, hence the text la. But according to Rabbeinu Tam, where one person's blowing the shofar for everyone, hence the text of al tekiyas. So therefore the question is over here by Daled Minim. The question is, as Jeff pointed out correctly, we do make a bracha al netilas lulav. That is the text. But based on the principle, should it be a la, a lito, or an al? Because let's go over it. So is lulav as Daled Minim a mandatory mitzvah or an optional mitzvah?
Mandatory.
It's mandatory. So based on the Rambam's klal, it should be a la. Do we make the bracha? Well, let's go to before. We make the bracha before or after?
Before.
Before. That should be a la. And what's the third principle? Are you doing it for yourself or for others? So therefore, based on those three principles, we should be making the bracha lito as the lulav. Why do we make the bracha al? So that first point isn't so clear. The first point, is that true that we do the bracha beforehand? Is that true? Do we make the bracha before we do the mitzvah or after? So that's a major point.
Well, we brought the...
First you put the position of the...
Right, so that...
You have obtained it.
So we do, so therefore you'll notice we do many things, so we try to make it before, because what's many things? The most standard approach is you pick up the lulav and you have the esrog turned around, because part of fulfilling the mitzvah, you have to hold it the way it grows. So you turn it upside down, you make the bracha, and then you turn it over to do the mitzvah. Or some people don't pick up all the different eights people try to do in order to avoid fulfilling the mitzvah. So Vilna Gaon points out, based on the Gemara in Sukkot, the Gemara's lashon is mida'ag bei nafikle. Once you pick it up, you fulfill the mitzvah. So therefore, even though we go through the different ways of trying to avoid it, the Vilna Gaon writes that bottom line is we don't fulfill the mitzvah until afterwards. And then that gets into also the mitzvah, there's one mitzvah of actually picking it up right away, but there's a mitzvah of doing it during the Hallel. In fact, Anshe Yushalayim used to walk around with the lulav and esrogim all day. So therefore, push comes to shove, even though we try many different ways to try to get over Lasiyasan, the bottom line is, when it comes to lulav and esrog, we probably fulfill the mitzvah first, and hence the bracha we make is al netilas lulav, because we end up doing the bracha after the mitzvah. That being said, we try to. So I guess in theory, if we tried and successful, we should make the la. But the standard text is al, and also because we fulfill as well. Go on.
But therefore, it appears that of these three rules, one of them has priority over the other two.
Right.
That's the sequence.
Right. The question in terms of conflict. Right. But in this case, you're doing it for yourself anyway. But right. But you're saying because certain mitzvahs you can't do, like a mitzvah shabagufo, like putting on tefillin. I can't be doing for someone else. I mean, I can be if I put it on their arm. I mean, I'm not doing it for them. I'm just helping them fulfill their own mitzvah. Or let's say mezuzah. If someone calls up and has some questions on the mezuzah, they want me to come and put them up for them, which happens many times. I make the person doing the actual putting up the mezuzah makes the bracha, but it's not my mitzvah. It's the person's who house. So therefore, you're right. But that'd be an interesting case, and there will be. We have to find cases. Ultimately, there'll be a priority if there's a conflict in the principles. that you'll have to do. So those are just a couple of the rules of some Hilchas Brachas. We will be making Al Netilas Lulav, and we will be making the Shechiyanu as well as always is the first time. And we'll have to continue on this during Sukkot.